Welcome to Introduction to Music. This particular video lecture is going to cover part 4, which is the classical period of music. And this lecture is going to be split into 2 parts. So let's get right into it. So classical period is a fairly short period when we're talking about, historically speaking, from 1750 to 1820. It's been called the Age of Enlightenment because this is a period of time when we see, as we've gone through the scientific revolution during the 1600s with people like Newton and Galileo, people are now beginning to, in the 1700s, rely more on the power of reason, on intellect, which means, of course, that the power of the church is being somewhat reduced, continues to be reduced. People believe in moving things forward socially, scientifically, and to be less tied down by traditions. As I think we've talked about in class, tradition is not a bad thing necessarily. It really depends on what use it's being put to and whether it's being used to keep people doing something for no reason or if it's being used for very specific reasons to connect people culturally. Attacks on the aristocracy. Now this is interesting because a lot of the philosophers of this age, people like Voltaire, were writing books and papers talking about how everyone deserves equality under the law and things like that. It eventually led to a lot of violence. We see this is the period when we have the 7 Years' War, we have the American Revolution, we have the French Revolution, we have the Napoleonic Wars, which was an outgrowth of the French Revolution. Basically, in the French Revolution, all the poor people, it was a point where, in time in France, where the aristocracy, King Louis XVI and the other nobles controlled everything, all of the wealth. They lived in unimaginable luxury while the vast majority of France was starving. And so at one point, finally, the poor people said, you know what, there are a lot more of us than there are of them. And they revolted and they overthrew the nobility and they killed most of them using the guillotine. And eventually then Napoleon, who you may have heard of, hopefully you've learned about Napoleon in history, he rose up to lead France, and they actually conquered much of Europe. He actually conquered much of Europe before he was defeated at Waterloo by the British. So all of this stuff happening is reducing the power of nobility through either violent or sometimes nonviolent means. The Congress of Vienna took place in the early 1800s, where a lot of the different countries got together and kind of drew up borders and made agreements without the need for wars. Basically, they had the peace conference before they even had a war in some respects. Happened after the Napoleonic Wars. That was, of course, the impetus for all of this. So a lot less nobility means all the money is being redistributed and there becomes a larger middle class, which actually has a huge effect on the arts, as we'll talk about. It leads to the transition of the status of musicians and artists in general, and we'll get to that. In art, now when we're talking about the Baroque era, we were talking about this very heavy, complicated, overly ornate, with every canvas, every statue being full of action style. That's gone. So a new style, which is called the Rococo, becomes predominant in visual arts, and the parallels in music are really remarkable. It's much lighter, it's much more graceful, and then the neoclassical style comes in the late 1700s, and this looks back to Greek and Roman art and architecture for that firm lines, clear structure. Now, this painting is such an amazing example that this is David's Death of Socrates, which he painted in 1787. If you've ever studied photography or studied art, you may have heard of the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is essentially that when you're framing a subject, when you're taking a picture, the important thing, the focus point, should not be dead center. It should be, you divide the picture into 3 thirds, and then so there are 2 dividing lines, and the focus point should be on one of those 2 dividing lines. So if you look at the rule of thirds here with this painting, you should take a close look at this on the PowerPoint. We'll see that there's a straight line here defined by this archway, a third of the way in. There's a straight line here defined by Socrates raising his hand up. The subject, Socrates, one of the great philosophers, was basically told by the government, you have to recant on all of the stuff that you've said. You have to go out in public and say you were wrong, or you have to kill yourself. And so he chose to die rather than to recant his beliefs. So this is a painting of when he's being given the cup of poison to drink, and he's speaking moralistically about the rights and wrongs of society at this time. So this is a great painting, and it really shows a lot of the classical ideals in art that get transferred to music. We have a single subject, important subject, with background actors. We have these clear division, clear balance, straight lines. We can see in the stonework, it's clearly lit. So this makes its way into classical music as well. And as I said, the parallels are quite remarkable. Timeline. Take a look at this in the PowerPoint. I'm not going to read it to you now. It just shows you basically what was going on in society, and then the parallels in art and in music. So, the classical style. Every time we switch eras, there has to be a corresponding change in musical style. If there's not, then we wouldn't be changing eras at all. It would be a continuation of the previous era. And almost everything is going to be in reaction to what came before it. So, for example, in the Baroque period, as we talked about, movements, individual pieces or individual movements of pieces would have one mood and one mood only. You did not change moods. If it started out happy, it stayed happy. Well, in the classical style, we now have a contrast of mood. It's not only very possible, but very common for a piece to start out slow and somber, and then immediately jump cut to fast and happy. That's something they'd never done before. Changes can be sudden, or you can gradually progress from, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which starts out in a minor key and gradually works its way through, and then it ends in a major key, very triumphant. In the Baroque period, we tend to use one rhythmic pattern over and over in these movements. That's one way that they can keep this continuity of mood. Well, in the classical style, we use many rhythmic patterns, and the rhythms tend to be more surprising using techniques like syncopation that we've talked about in class. And even pauses. This actually came out of a place in Germany called the Mannheim School, where the music's cooking along and then just stops, and then starts again, just to mix things up, to surprise the listener a little bit. Texture. Well, let's go back to that painting now. In the Baroque period, texture was frequently polyphonic, imitative polyphonic, where you have lots of different lines of music competing with each other for your attention. In the classical period, the texture is primarily homophonic, which means you have one main melody which is supported by other music. If you think that painting, there's one figure that is front and center and lit better than everything else, and that was Socrates. Everything else around him was a background actor. It's the same thing in music. You have one major melody, everything else is supporting material. The melodies, well, in the Baroque period, we have these long, complicated melodies that might last 20, 25 seconds long and don't have clear cadence points and clear structure. Well, in the classical period, they go for melodies that are shorter, more balanced, and very easy to remember. I could play almost any piece of Mozart for you, and you would be able to whistle the melody back to me after hearing it just once, whereas that's almost impossible to do with a lot of Baroque music. And finally, dynamics. Now, we talked about in the Baroque period, the dynamics are primarily what we call terraced dynamics. That is, sudden changes from loud to soft and soft to loud, because that's what the keyboard instruments of the time could do. They didn't have the ability to gradually get louder or softer. Well, the invention of the piano was invented in the year 1700 by a gentleman named Bartolomeo Cristofori, and this was the first keyboard instrument where you could change the volume simply by changing your finger pressure. If you press down harder, it gets loud. If you press down softer, it gets softer. And so you could do crescendos and diminuendos. So this was invented in 1700, but you have to understand that there was no mass production at the time. All the pianos were made one at a time, and so they were expensive, and it took a long time to build enough pianos that eventually the cost came down and there were enough pianos that had been produced that by 1775 or so, the piano had almost entirely replaced the harpsichord as the keyboard instrument of choice for everyone who could get one. Because it could crescendo and diminuendo, this actually helped lead to the style in the classical era of utilizing these crescendos and diminuendos. This is maybe the most characteristic thing about the classical period. If you think back to when we talked about in the Baroque period, the orchestra tended to be in 3 units. First you had the continuo, which was keyboard and a bass instrument holding down the chord structure. And then you had members of the violin family, and then finally you had variable instruments. You know, the composer would add other instruments to the orchestra if those instruments were available to be used. But if you wrote a piece of music and then went to another town, there was no guarantee that they had the players that could play your music for you. The classical period becomes very standardized. By the middle of the classical period or so, almost every orchestra had the same basic instrumentation. And it was split into the 4 sections: strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. So in your string section, still members of the violin family, we have violin 1, violin 2. Still, they're all playing the same instrument, just violin 1 plays a higher part, violin 2 plays a lower harmony part, viola playing the alto line, cello playing the tenor line, and the bass, the double bass, which is not a member of the violin family, but it's similar, it's a gamba, viola da gamba, playing the bass line. This is very standard in the classical period to have the strings divided this way. Woodwinds and brass. My old music history teacher used to say that the classical orchestra was like the Noah's Ark of music, because we have 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, and 2 bassoons in the woodwind section. In the brass section, we have 2 French horns and 2 trumpets. And then in the percussion section, we have 2 timpani, tuned drums, being played by 1 player. So, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, Noah's Ark of the classical music world. And this was pretty standard, as I said. If Mozart wrote a piece in Vienna and then traveled to Prague, the orchestras in Prague had the same instrumentation, had players on all of these parts so that he could perform his music anywhere. Same with Haydn, could travel to London and they would have all the instruments that he would need, or whatever. Each section had its job. The strings frequently carried the melody, especially in violin 1 and sometimes in the cello, and they also provided accompaniment. The other strings would accompany that melody. The woodwinds, well, they created timbre, a contrast in timbre, and also the composer would frequently write solos for these woodwind instruments. Brass, the brass didn't usually carry the melody. That was incredibly rare for a couple of reasons, one of which is the brass at the time had no valves, so they could not play the complete scale of notes. They could only play certain notes. So they were used to provide emphasis at cadence points. The same with the timpani. The timpani and the brass, especially the trumpets, are used to provide emphasis at cadence points, but they were not melodic instruments at all. So you can see in this slide, and take a close look at this slide when you're going through the PowerPoint. Up top we have the Baroque orchestra. You've got your continuo in the middle, you've got your violins, and you've got your auxiliary instruments. Down here we have a chart of what the classical orchestra would look like. Conductor. In the Baroque period, the orchestra was almost always led by the person playing harpsichord. They didn't have a separate conductor. That's something that starts to come along in the classical period, really reaches its height in the Romantic period, the next era we're going to talk about. You've got your first violins, your second violins, your violas, your cellos, and your basses. Sometimes orchestras rearrange the way they're seated, but they would never rearrange the instruments. And then your woodwinds, flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, 2 trumpets, 2 French horns, and it should be 2 timpani. I really don't know why they have 3 timpani in this picture. So, classical music, which we've talked about is more appropriately called Western art music, but classical music is called classical music, classical with a small c, meaning generally all music of this style, of this, that whole idea of playing string instruments and playing formal music in a formal setting. Classical with a capital C is from this era. The reason why classical music generically has gotten the title classical music, I think, is because so many important developments came out of the classical period in addition to three of the most famous composers who've ever written music, came out of this period as well. So it's kind of lent its name to everything. One of the things that happened in this classical period was forms became quite standardized, and many composers for the last 250 to 300 years have been using these forms that were developed and refined during the classical period as a departure point. Even if they vary what's happening, many times they used what was invented during this period as a departure point. So, some things that were happening. First of all, instrumental music for the first time really becomes more important than vocal music. Yes, there's still vocal music. There will always be vocal music. People are still writing songs in masses and operas and things like that, and hymns. But instrumental music in art music became more important, ultimately. Most compositions were in multiple movements, with 4 being the most standard number of movements, so 4 different standalone chapters, each one with an ending. And these movements would all contrast each other. For example, the first movement is frequently fast, and then the second movement is frequently slow, and then the third movement is kind of like a dance movement, usually in a triple meter, and then the fourth movement would be fast again. This became the standard format for the symphony and for string quartets, which were probably, symphony is certainly something that all composers have aspired to write since then, and it's one of the most attempted genres of music. Same with the string quartet. Each movement can be in a different structure. Now, what are these structures? Well, we'll get to that in just a moment. So, I mentioned the middle class. This growth in the middle class really changed the way music was consumed, which changed the way musicians could be professionals. This growing middle class wanted the things that up to this point only the aristocracy had. They wanted music, they wanted literature, they wanted theater. So, and when I said they wanted music, they wanted to be able to go hear professional music, so they started staging concerts. Entrepreneurs, professional musicians, started staging concerts where anybody could buy a ticket to go see it. Up to this point, that had only been seen in Italian opera, where, if you remember in the last unit, they talked about in 1637, the first public opera house opened in Venice, Italy. For quite a while, it was still only operas were open to the paying public, but now people started to stage concerts where anyone could buy a ticket to go hear an orchestra or go hear chamber music. People wanted music lessons for their children and for themselves in some cases. So this is another income stream that musicians had, is teaching lessons to children of the middle class. Composers wrote music that they knew the middle class would appreciate. Instead of just writing music that would appeal to very wealthy, highly educated, snobby people, they wrote music that would appeal more to people with just more general tastes, the middle class. And even the most serious music frequently was influenced by both popular songs of the time and folk music, so that it would be more appealing for everybody. Opera, which had always been serious opera, well, in the early 1700s, we start to see a move towards comic opera. So now we have opera seria, but we also have opera comique, and every country had its own version of comic opera. So because more income streams become available to the composer can, to some degree, begin to become independent of the nobility or the church, who they've always pretty much been locked into working for. And we can trace this in the transition of 3 composers, 3 most famous composers of the classical era. Joseph Haydn, who was the oldest of these composers, was born in 1732. He spent most of his career working as a servant for a very wealthy Hungarian family called the Esterházy family. Mozart came along 24 years later. Mozart was born in 1756, and he started out working for a court. Well, he started out as a child star, we'll get to that, but then he worked for a court of the nobility, the Archbishop of Salzburg, but he didn't like being a servant, and so he moved to Vienna and made a go at it as a freelance musician, and he was initially successful, but he eventually died flat broke. He died at age 35 of, some people say scarlet fever, and was buried in a mass grave. So we don't actually even know where Mozart is buried. And then Beethoven. Beethoven was the third of these great composers. He was born in 1770, so 14 years after Mozart. He never worked for the courts of the nobility. He never worked for the church. He was completely an independent musician who was wildly successful, and was the most famous musician in all of Europe. And when he died, 10,000 people attended his funeral. Let's talk a little bit about Vienna. Vienna, Austria. Every era has more or less had its musical capital. Back in the Middle Ages, Paris was the musical capital of Europe. When we got to the Renaissance, Venice, Italy, was one of the musical capitals of Europe. During the classical period, Vienna, Austria was kind of the heart of the classical music world. Everybody went to Vienna. It was a huge commercial center. It was a huge cultural center. So if you're a musician, just like for a long period of time in this country, if you were a musician, you moved to New York, everyone went to Vienna. Haydn went to Vienna, Mozart went to Vienna, Beethoven went to Vienna, later composers like Schubert went to Vienna. So that's where you went to be heard and to try and get famous. The wealthy, who would have estates all over Europe, especially Austria and Hungary were part of a joint empire called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so they were politically linked. So we get, say, the Esterházy family, who employed Haydn. They had their estates all the way out here in Esterházy. They would actually pack up everybody, including their whole orchestra, and go to Vienna for the winter, and then they would spend the whole winter partying. And you needed your music with you if you were going to entertain your friends, so they would bring all of their musicians with them. Okay, so what kinds of music were composers writing? How was it being written? Well, one thing that came out of this period is several structures, forms, that is, ways to arrange music, ways to arrange your melodies, were developed, were refined, and still today, are very standard ways to write your music. We've talked in class about simple structures like ABA, where you have a melody, and then you have a contrasting section, and then you go back to the first section. Well, these next few things I'm going to run through, we're not going to get into any real great detail on these, but there's just an example of how music was being arranged during the classical period. Sonata form. Sonata form is a form that is used for one individual movement of a larger work, and it's relatively complicated, but straightforward. It's kind of a big ABA, in that A is the exposition. Within this exposition, we have two different themes, and we have multiple keys that kind of create a contrast. After the exposition, we go to the development. In the development section, the composer will take some stuff from the exposition, little fragments, melodies, motives, and kind of mix them all together and chop them up and go through a lot of different modulations, changing the key, changing the harmonies to make it very dramatic. And then at the end of the development, the recapitulation, back to the A section, where we basically restate everything that happens at the beginning. So exposition, A, development, B, recapitulation, A, B, A. Sometimes they would tack a coda on the end, which would be like a big exclamation point. In TV shows, you've got your different chapters of the TV show. You've got your opening, and you've got your first chapter, and then a commercial break, second chapter, commercial break. And then at the very end, sometimes there's just a short little tag that kind of resolves what's happening. Or if you think of one of the Marvel superhero movies, a lot of times the movie ends, and then they start rolling the credits, but then another scene shows up. Well, that's kind of what the coda is. The movement ends, but they tag a little part on the end to give it a really strong ending. Sonata form is still being used by composers today. It was finalized well over 200 years ago, but people still think it's a very logical way to write your music that makes sense to the audience. As are these other ones, theme and variation. Theme and variation, I think we've talked about this in class a little bit, is when you basically write a musical theme, and then you just keep repeating that theme, but every time you repeat it, you change it somehow, you vary it somehow. So, instead of A, B, C, or A, B, A, or whatever, we have A, A1, A2, A3. Every time you change it, you have to give it another number. Each variation there are many ways to vary the melody. You can change the mood, you can change the key, you can change the rhythm somewhat. You can certainly change the instrumentation so that the timbre is different. As creative as you want to be. There just has to be the length of the original melody and enough of the original melody left in there that it's obviously a variation and not something new. Very popular form which people are still writing to this day. I've played sets of theme and variations that have been written fairly recently for trombone and piano. The minuet and trio. Now, minuet was a dance in a triple meter, kind of like a waltz. So this actually grew out of the Baroque period when musicians would play to accompany the dancing of the wealthy and the aristocracy. But it's in triple meter, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You have your dance-like thing, and then there's a contrast, which is the trio, which is usually played by a smaller group of musicians, and then you go back to the minuet. In other words, yet another one of these ABA forms that we've talked about. The minuet and trio gradually went out of style when they replaced it with something called a scherzo, but the idea of having the third movement of one of these large 4-minute movement works be somehow dance-related is still around to this day. The rondo. Rondo is a form where basically you have your original theme, we'll call it A, and then something new, we'll call it B. And then we have to go back to A. And then we either go back to B or we go back to something else, or bring in something else new, which we'll call C. The important thing in a rondo is A alternates. It's always A, something else, A, something else, A, something else, A, something else, for as long as you want to stretch that rondo out. In the Baroque period, I was talking about ritornello form. Rondo is very similar to that, in that you have your main theme, something else, and then the main theme again, something else, main theme again, something else. So it might look like A, B, A, C, A, B, A is a pretty standard rondo form. Why am I talking about these structures? Well, because these are ways that were used in the classical era to arrange your music, to compose your music, that are still used to this day. You know, they're very logical ways to write music so that the listener can kind of understand what's happening. If the structure is weird in a piece of music, then it's going to be very difficult to follow. All of this talk about forms and genres and structures and 4 movements kind of came to the head in the symphony. Symphony is really one of the most important words in all of classical music. Groups of people who play these things are called symphony orchestras. Where do they play them? Frequently in a place called symphony hall. So the symphony is a large instrumental work, usually somewhere between 20 and 45 minutes during this period of time. Later in time, it gets longer and longer. Typically, the symphony is in 4 movements. First one fast, second one slow, third one the dance-like movement, and the fourth one fast again. Everything we've been talking about, kind of wrapped up in one extended composition. Remember, each movement is like a separate chapter that has an ending. There's a pause before we go on and play again. The symphony was very popular among composers of the classical era and ever since then because you're writing a large piece for the full orchestra. It's kind of like writing a novel instead of writing a short story. Nothing wrong with short stories. Short stories can be fantastic, but a lot of people who write, they really want to write a novel because it's long and gives them lots of room for their creativity, and that's what the symphony is. And you got to write for the whole orchestra, so you got to use all the woodwinds and strings and brass and percussion available at the time to make as much of a dramatic statement as you could. Symphonies, very important. Haydn wrote 104 symphonies. That's part of his job. Mozart wrote 41 symphonies. He died young. Beethoven only wrote 9 symphonies. But I'm going to talk about why that number is going down when I talk about each of these separate composers. I'm going to put up a link to the first movement of Mozart's Symphony Number 40 in G minor. Probably a symphony you're going to recognize to some degree, actually. The melody was used as a ringtone in cell phones maybe 10, 15 years ago when cell phones were first becoming really popular. This first movement has your contrasting moods, 2 different themes that contrast with each other, multiple rhythmic patterns, setting up this contrast of moods, everything we've talked about. Primarily homophonic with one main melody with accompaniment underneath. The melody is short and easy to remember. I guarantee you'll be able to whistle this after hearing it one time. And then the use of crescendo and diminuendo dynamics, because this symphony kind of encapsulates everything that we've talked about in classical music. 2 more slides in this particular part of the lecture. So first, or next, in addition to the symphony, during the classical era, the concerto became really standardized. What's a concerto? 3-movement work, not 4 movements, 3-movement work for an instrumental soloist with the orchestra accompanying that soloist. It's all about having a great performer, a virtuoso performer, contrasting against the larger group. You can't have a concerto without the accompaniment, but you certainly can't have a concerto without the soloist also. As I said, 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. They kick out the dance-like movement that we hear in the symphony. Many times at the end of a movement, the soloist will perform by themselves. The orchestra will stop and the soloist will play. This is called a cadenza. A cadenza is an opportunity for the soloist to really show off their technical and musical skills. During this period, many times the cadenza was improvised. The orchestra would cadence and the soloist would just improvise for as long as they felt like improvising, trying to draw what they were doing from the music that had already been played, using that as a departure point. And then they would give a signal, usually a trill, rapidly alternating between 2 notes, and then the orchestra would start again and they would end. I'm going to put in a link to the Haydn Trumpet Concerto. The video I think I'm going to post is performed by Wynton Marsalis, the great American trumpet player. And you can just see how the trumpet soloist is being contrasted against the orchestra accompaniment. Last slide in this part of the lecture. Chamber music. Classical chamber music. What really sets chamber music apart from large works is it's played by a small group of musicians, at least 2, and usually no more than 8 or 9, and it usually doesn't use a conductor. All of the musicians kind of are responsible for keeping it together by watching and listening to each other, and they also have to make the decisions in kind of a democratic way instead of being told what to do by the conductor. Why is it called chamber music? Well, this is music that was originally written to be performed in small rooms. Instead of large concert rooms, it was written to be performed in small chambers. It was used originally to entertain the wealthy, the noble. Lighter sounding orchestra, obviously. Many fewer musicians. No conductor, as I said. The most standard form of chamber music that there was in this time and still is to this day is the string quartet. String quartet means both the group that plays it and the music that's written for them to play is usually titled string quartet. String quartet number 1 in G, for example. So, a string quartet, 2 violins, viola, cello. Violin 1 playing soprano, violin 2 playing alto, viola playing the tenor line, and cello playing the bass line in this case. Most string quartets are in 4 movements. First one fast, second one slow, third one the dance movement, fourth one fast, just like the symphony. And I'll put in a link now to a Haydn string quartet. Joseph Haydn was nicknamed the father of the string quartet because he wrote great string quartets, which kind of set the form and the style for people who came after him. Okay, so that's chapters 1 through 9 of the part 4 video lecture. We're going to move on. There is a homework assignment that will be due, and that contrasts music from the Baroque with music from the classical. And then the next video lecture, we're going to focus on specifically the 3 great composers of the day, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven.